Welcome back to Real Estate 101. Today we're going to continue our discussion on family law and talk a little bit about sharing the home's value after separation. And I'm pleased to be joined once again by John Schuman of Devery Smith Frank. John, welcome back to the show.
It's good to be back, Joe.
All right, John. So with home values increasing here in Ontario, about an average at least 10% every year, usually divorces on average, they take at least a year, I would assume, to go through the courts.
Yeah, especially if you go through court.
To courts, right?
Quick if you don't go through court.
So what happens with the value of the home, during that year? How is that shared?
Well, that depends on a lot of things, like who owns the home, whether the parties were married, whether there's support being paid, whether one of the spouses is still paying for all the expenses related to the home or not.
Right.
All those factor into it.
Okay, so how about in common situations where two spouses own the home together and one of them leaves, leaving the other one to pay all the bills?
Well, if they're both legally on title, which means they both legally own the home, then the presumption under the law is that when the home is sold, they will share the proceeds of sale equally.
All right. Now, there are some people out there that have long debated that they find it unfair that one person stays in the home, pays all the bills, and then the other one who left, they also share in the increase in value when they really didn't have to do anything.
Yeah, well, that comes down to these things that the courts use called the principles of equity. And the principles of equity are done to do fairness, and they're to correct an unfairness. And that's a situation where it's commonly thought that it's unfair, especially where one spouse leaves and doesn't contribute anything to the home, and the other spouse continues to pay all the bills, the mortgage, the upkeep, everything else. And as a result, the person who stayed is out money, and the person who left has got this sort of windfall of money because they're not having to contribute to the home anymore. Mm-hmm. So when that happens, there's this idea that it'd be unfair to consider the home to be jointly owned. So the courts, if you go to court, or you can agree outside of court or go to an arbitration, the courts would say that we're not going to consider the home to be jointly owned because you, the person who left, isn't treating it like your home anymore. You're treating it like it's just the other person's home. You're letting them deal with everything about the home.
Right.
So when that happens, then the court would say, well, no, the person who stayed, they're really the owner of the home, and they can declare that person is the owner of the home, and they get all the increase in value. Mm-hmm. And so that's one way of recognizing the unfairness. But there's also the other side of that, is that the person who left put money into the home at some point, and they're a joint owner now. And because they're a joint owner now, they lose out from having ownership in that home because the other person left. And they also aren't getting any rent, because otherwise, if both parties left, they could rent the home, and that person would get half the rent. So another consideration, what is fair, is whether or not the person who left should also have been getting rent from the person who stayed for basically renting half the home. And those sort of balance out to decide what would be fair in the situation.
Okay, so what happens in the situation where one spouse is on title and that spouse decides to stay in the home?
Well, if that one spouse is on title and that one spouse is sharing or paying all the expenses of keeping the home, then it's simple. That spouse gets the increase in value in the home.
All right, so we both have heard of situations where one person is on title, one spouse is on title, the other spouse would like to remain in the home, so they call the police and, I don't want to say accuse the other spouse of something, but they call the police to try to get the other person out of the home. You've seen this happen before. Is there a way, how does that work? What would you do if you're in a situation like that?
Well, the situation of the charges or the police involvement does not in itself affect anything in regard to the ownership of the home or who shares in the value. What's important in that question is really the person who owns the home is out of the home, right? And the person who has no interest in the home, no legal interest in the home, is in the home and basically living there rent free. So under that situation, it's a consideration of, is the person who is staying in the home, are they paying for the home still? Are they paying the mortgage, the utilities, and all those sorts of things? Because then if they're paying for the upkeep of the home, then perhaps they should have get some share in the increase in the value. Right. If you remember from a previous episode, we talked about how things are shared, and you don't share the actual asset, you share the value of the asset.
Right.
And you don't, a matrimonial home, you always share the full value up to the date of separation. So up until the time that one person got kicked out of the house, the value in that house is being shared equally. So what happens afterwards, even when the person who owns the house has been kicked out, because ordinarily that person would get the increase in value. And if that person is continuing to pay the expenses in relation to the home, then that person is continuing to get the increase in value. If the other spouse is staying and is paying the mortgage and the utilities and everything else, then maybe that spouse will get an increase in value. But you have to consider the other factors, that that person has no interest in the home. And in different situations, that spouse would be paying rent to live in that home. And so the question is, if that spouse is paying for the mortgage, the property taxes, the utilities, all the upkeep, do all those expenses, are they worth more than the rent that that spouse would pay on the house? Because if they're not worth the same as the rent, then that spouse should have no increase in the value in the home, because they're benefiting anyways. They're getting something for nothing.
All right.
But if the house was recently bought, or the mortgage is huge, or they're paying a lot of upkeep and maintenance, then maybe they do get to share in the increase in value, because they're paying more than they would have to pay for rent. And so what it really comes down to is the spouse who's staying, who doesn't have any interest in the home, paying more to stay there than they would if they were paying rent on the open market.
So that's how they look at it.
That's how you look at it. That's coming up from the fairness perspective.
Okay, so is it different if the spouses are living together common law instead of being married?
It is a little bit different because, as we talked about in another previous episode, there's common law spouses have no right to share in each other's property. So everything goes by title. So if one spouse had owned the house entirely, the other spouse does not share in that at all during the relationship, and they won't share in the value of it after the separation.
And the increase, right?
Unless they contribute something to the house after separation. They pay for things in relation to the house more than they would have to pay to stay in the house. And if the spouse if they share the costs afterwards, then still the spouse who owns the house, because in common law situations you don't have a right to the other person's property unless you can show you contributed more into that piece of property than you got out of it. So if one spouse had contributed paid more than they would have to pay for rent throughout the relationship, and they always treat it like their same home, then they may share in the value.
Right.
But when you get into that sort of situation, you get into complex common law questions, you really need to talk to a family lawyer to make sure you're getting what you're supposed to, and what your rights are being enforced in that situation.
Okay, so do things always work out fairly for both spouses? And if not, is there anything that can be done to make it more fair?
Well, fairness is a bit of a perspective from the person. If you're the person who got to stay in the house for free, then you might think that was really fair. If you're the person who didn't, who's paying and getting nothing out of it, you think it was really unfair. But you can give yourself some predictability. You can control what happens after separation and what happens to the value of your home after separation and whether it's shared or not by having a marriage contract, or if you're a common law cohabitation agreement. And by having a marriage contract, you can set up specifically who gets what value out of the home. You can specifically say it's not shared or it is shared, and after separation, this is what will happen. One thing you cannot do, however, is you cannot say that one spouse has to move out of the home after separation. You're not allowed to do that with a marriage contract.
Okay, so can you put a matrimonial home into a trust or even have it owned by a corporation in order to get around the law?
No, I mean, when the legislature drafted the Family Law Act, they actually thought about people doing that. And those sorts of things where you're having a matrimonial home owned indirectly, they specifically said that that's still going to be a matrimonial home, the value to be divided. So if you own a home indirectly through a trust or through a corporation, it's still divided as if you owned it straight out. That's how the Family Law Act works.
Right. Now, just because the home is owned by a trust or corporation doesn't necessarily mean that you're doing it for the purposes of trying to get around the law.
No, it doesn't mean you're trying to get around the law. And it means
just even if you tried to use that way to get around the law, it wouldn't work.
No, that's right. It's specifically set out that if it's a matrimonial home and you own it indirectly, you still have to share in the value with your spouse.
All right, John. So for viewers and listeners of our show who are going through something like this and may need the help of a lawyer, how can they get in contact with you?
Well, you can reach me at 416-446-5080 or through our website, which is www.devrylaw.ca. Or you can follow me on Twitter at @HumanFamLaw, or go to my Facebook page.
All right, good stuff. John, thanks for coming on today's show.
It's glad to be here, Joe.
So there you have it. If you're looking for a top family lawyer, get in contact with John Schuman of Devery Smith Frank. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel, comment, like, and share our videos. I'm Joe. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.